The city still wore its early morning quiet like a fragile coat. The streets were mostly empty except for the occasional delivery truck rumbling past, exhaust curling into the frigid air. A thin veil of frost coated the sidewalks, glistening faintly under the pale winter sun that had only just risen above the brick rooftops. At the corner of Maple and Fifth, an aging wooden bus shelter stood sentinel, its plexiglass panels clouded with condensation. The peeling route map inside looked almost ghostly through the fogged surface. Standing near the shelter, leaning slightly on a polished wooden cane, was Harold Bennett. His frame was wiry, but still upright, the posture of a man who had once stood taller, straighter, with the kind of discipline only years of responsibility could bring. He wore a long, dark wool overcoat, its collar turned up against the biting wind, and a neatly pressed flat cap pulled low over his brow. His gloved hands, slightly worn at the fingertips, gripped the cane in front of him while the other clutched a weathered leather briefcase. Each breath Harold exhaled became a small cloud, dispersing quickly into the cold. His eyes, sharp but softened by age, scanned the street in the direction from which the bus would come. He wasn't impatient exactly, just waiting. The way someone waits for something they've done 1,000 times before, trusting in a schedule that should be as dependable as the sunrise. A faint sound of traffic drifted from a few blocks away, the distant growl of an engine, the metallic clatter of a garbage truck emptying bins. Somewhere behind him, a coffee shop door chimed as early customers went in for warmth. A young woman in a bright puffer jacket passed Harold, earbuds in, offering him a brief smile before hurrying on. He gave a small nod in return, his lips curling just slightly at the kindness. The bus was due any minute now. Harold shifted his weight to ease the pressure on his right knee, which had never been the same since an injury decades ago. Despite the chill, he stood with quiet dignity, not huddled or hunched, but present, patient, and prepared. In the distance, a familiar rumble began to grow louder. Harold's gaze lifted, and there it was, the city bus, painted in its usual deep blue and cream, approaching from the far end of the street. He adjusted his stance, ready to step forward when it reached the stop, the way he had done countless times before. What he didn't know was that this morning would be different. Very different. The city bus, a long, diesel-powered beast, with scuffed paint and streaks of road grime along its sides, growled its way up Maple Avenue. Inside the cab, Carl Weaver sat behind the oversized steering wheel, the hum of the engine vibrating faintly beneath him. Carl was in his early 40s, with close-cropped sandy hair, a weathered jawline, and the slight paunch of someone who lived on convenience store snacks between shifts. He'd been driving this route for years, long enough to think he could size up every passenger in a split second. As the bus neared the corner of Maple and Fifth, Carl's eyes flicked toward the shelter. He saw Harold Bennett standing there, the dark overcoat, the cane, the well-worn leather briefcase at his side. Harold wasn't waving frantically or stepping into the road like some passengers did. He just stood there with quiet composure, waiting. But Carl's gaze lingered, narrowing slightly. The man looked old, maybe late 70s, and there was something about that battered briefcase and the old-fashioned coat that struck Carl as out of place for the morning rush. No obvious transit pass in sight, no phone in his hand, no sign he'd just come from work. In Carl's mind, a quick story began to form, the kind that isn't spoken out loud, but colors every action that follows. Probably can't pay. Probably one of those who'll argue about the fare. Probably trouble. It wasn't the first time Carl had thought this about someone, and it wouldn't have been the last. Except today, this silent judgment would take on a whole different weight. He tapped the brakes lightly as the bus approached the stop, but his foot didn't commit. The air brakes hissed faintly, teasing a slowdown, then eased off. From his elevated seat, Carl looked down at Harold through the side window. The older man's face was calm, expectant, and focused on the front of the bus. Their eyes almost met. Almost. Before Carl shifted his gaze back to the road ahead. Inside the bus, a few passengers noticed the stop approaching. A middle-aged woman near the front, clutching a tote bag, glanced toward the shelter as if expecting to pick up someone. Carl's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. The decision was already made in his mind, though he wouldn't have admitted it if asked. He pressed the accelerator gently, and the bus rolled past the stop, its massive frame sliding between Harold and the rising sun. The roar of the engine deepened as Carl kept his foot steady on the accelerator, the bus gliding forward instead of slowing to a stop. The cold morning air outside carried the sound of its heavy tires slicing over patches of frost. From the shelter, Harold Bennett took a single step forward, the tip of his cane tapping softly against the concrete. His eyes followed the bus, expecting it to brake. He adjusted his grip on the worn leather briefcase, shifting it slightly against his leg, ready to board. But the front wheels never turned toward the curb. The hiss of air brakes never came. Instead, the bus's hulking frame slid right past him, the tall windows reflecting his image in quick, fractured glimpses, a face in motion, a figure erased in seconds. Inside the bus, several passengers had noticed. A young man in a denim jacket near the middle turned his head to watch Harold fade behind them, his brow knitting in confusion. A woman near the front, the same one with the tote bag from earlier, leaned toward the aisle. "Wasn't someone waiting there?" she murmured to no one in particular. Carl didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, his jaw set in that tight, neutral mask he'd perfected for long shifts. As the bus passed, Harold remained at the stop, his figure framed briefly in the side mirror. He didn't shout. He didn't wave his cane in frustration. He simply stood, the wind tugging lightly at the hem of his coat, his gaze following the vehicle until it disappeared around the corner. For a few seconds after the stop was gone, the inside of the bus felt quieter than usual, as if the small, unspoken wrongness of what had happened had settled into the air. Someone coughed, a phone dinged, but no one confronted the driver. Back at the shelter, Harold let out a slow breath, the cold air turning it to mist. He shifted his weight, leaning just a little heavier on his cane, then glanced at the timetable posted inside the fogged plexiglass. The next bus wouldn't come for another 25 minutes. It was going to be a long, cold wait. The depot was a sprawling industrial lot tucked behind a chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire, its asphalt blackened from decades of diesel spills and tire wear. Buses moved in and out in a steady rhythm, their engines growling like restless animals returning to their cages. The faint tang of motor oil hung in the cold air. Carl Weaver guided his bus through the wide gates, following the painted arrows toward the maintenance bay. The fluorescent lights inside flickered in patches, illuminating the skeletal metal frames of buses up on lifts, their engines exposed. Carl pulled into his assigned lane, the hiss of the brakes filling the cab. He flipped the switches to shut down the engine, grabbed his thermos from the cup holder, and prepared to head into the break room. It had been an unremarkable morning, at least to him. Another shift, another round of faces in and out, most forgotten before the next stop. But as he stepped down from the bus, the sight waiting for him was anything but routine. Near the depot office, Donna Pierce, the shift dispatcher, stood with her arms folded, her brow furrowed in a way that suggested this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. Beside her was a man in a charcoal gray overcoat, his ID badge on a lanyard reading City Transit Commission. He was tall, clean-shaven, and looked like he'd been in enough official meetings to have perfected a patient, unreadable expression. And standing between them, leaning on his polished wooden cane, was Harold Bennett. Carl's first reaction was confusion. It took him a second to register the man from the stop that morning, the one he'd driven past without so much as a glance in the mirror afterward. Harold was looking right at him now, his eyes steady, his expression calm but impossible to read. "Carl," Donna called out, her tone clipped. "We need to talk." Carl approached slowly, shifting his thermos from one hand to the other. "What's this about?" he asked, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "This," Donna said, tilting her head toward Harold, "is Mr. Bennett. The Transit Commission has been trying to get him here for weeks for a special visit. This morning was supposed to be it." Carl's eyes flicked to Harold, then to the man from the commission, then back. "Okay, but what's that got to do with me?" The commission rep spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth but carried the weight of authority. "Mr. Bennett was waiting for the number 12 bus this morning at Maple and 5th. That's your route, isn't it?" Carl's mouth felt suddenly dry. "Yeah, but you didn't stop," the man said plainly. "And I'd like to know why." Carl glanced again at Harold, who still hadn't spoken. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was something else. Something heavier. Carl didn't know it yet. But he was about to find out exactly who the man he'd ignored really was. The cold from outside still clung to Carl's jacket as he stood in the depot's open bay, his breath faintly visible in the unheated air. The rumble of idling buses in the distance filled the silence between questions, a mechanical heartbeat for the building. Donna Pierce, the dispatcher, took a step closer, her clipboard pressed tight against her chest. "Carl," she said evenly, "you need to understand something before you answer that man's question." She tilted her chin toward Harold Bennett. "This isn't just any passenger." Carl glanced sideways at Harold, the neat flat cap, the long wool coat, the cane held in a steady grip. There was a kind of self-possession in the older man's stance that Carl hadn't noticed that morning. Out there at the stop, he'd seemed quiet, maybe even fragile. Here, he seemed unshakable. The Transit Commission representative adjusted his lanyard and stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett isn't simply here for a ride," he said. His voice had a tone Carl recognized from safety briefings, the tone people used when delivering facts that carried weight. "He is here because we invited him. We've been trying to get him down to the depot to honor his work, to show him what his vision built." Carl frowned. "His vision?" Harold finally spoke. His voice was warm, deep, and deliberate, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who chose his words carefully. "Son, I spent over 30 years of my life building the foundation for the very transit system you work for today. I started when there were only a handful of routes, and half the city didn't even have reliable buses. I fought for funding, for expansion, for accessible stops, for the hiring of more drivers, and for fair treatment of every passenger who steps onto one of these vehicles." Carl blinked, caught between disbelief and the slow dawning of recognition. He had heard the name Harold Bennett before, usually in passing at driver orientations, when trainers referenced the Bennett reforms that had modernized the city's bus fleet decades ago. But he'd never put a face to the name. The commission rep smiled faintly, watching Carl's reaction. "Mr. Bennett was the founder and first director of the City Transit Authority. Without him, this depot wouldn't exist, these buses wouldn't be here, and most of us wouldn't have these jobs," Donna added, her voice softer now. "Today was supposed to be a surprise welcome. Show him around, let him see how far we've come. He should have been on your bus this morning." Carl felt the weight of the words sink in. The man he had dismissed as just another inconvenient passenger wasn't just a somebody. He was the somebody, the cornerstone of the entire operation. Harold's gaze stayed locked on him, steady but not hostile. There was no gloating, no overt anger, just a quiet expectation for Carl to realize the gravity of his choice. Carl shifted uncomfortably, his grip on his thermos tightening. "I didn't know," he muttered. "That's the problem," Harold replied gently. "You didn't need to know who I was to do the right thing." The depot's break area, a wide open space between the bays, had begun to fill with curious onlookers. Word had spread quickly among the drivers and mechanics. "Harold Bennett is here." Men in oil-stained coveralls leaned casually against tool carts. A few drivers in uniform stood near the vending machines, coffee cups in hand, watching the scene unfold. The Transit Commission representative, sensing the moment, turned toward the small crowd. "Since many of you weren't around back then, let me make something clear," he began, his voice carrying easily over the low thrum of idling engines. "The very buses you operate, the schedules you follow, and the rights you and every passenger and rely on exist because of this man." He gestured toward Harold, who stood with his cane planted firmly, his posture straight despite the years. "Mr. Harold Bennett," the rep continued, "was the first director of the City Transit Authority. He didn't just run buses. He built the system from the ground up. He lobbied City Hall for funding when they said public transit wasn't worth investing in. He expanded routes into neighborhoods that had been ignored for decades. He fought for disability access long before it was legally required. And he ensured that our hiring policies gave opportunities to people of all backgrounds. He believed this system should serve everyone, not just the people who looked like they belonged on it." A low murmur of respect moved through the group. Heads nodded. A mechanic in a grease-streaked cap muttered, "Didn't know he was still around," and another replied quietly, "Living legend." Carl felt the eyes of his co-workers on him now, though no one said anything outright. He could feel the unspoken judgment in the air. They'd all heard enough to put together what must have happened at that stop this morning. Donna, the dispatcher, looked from Harold to Carl. When you drove past Maple and Fifth, Carl, you didn't just pass a passenger. You passed the man who made it possible for you to be behind that wheel. Harold didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His presence, his history, and the quiet dignity in his bearing spoke louder than any accusation. Finally, Harold addressed the gathered employees. I didn't come here today to cause trouble, he said. I came because I wanted to see how far we've come. I wanted to see the faces of the people who carry forward what we built. Every passenger, no matter their age, their clothes, or what you think you know about them, deserves the same respect you'd give the mayor if he stepped onto your bus. That's the principle this place was built on, and that's how you honor the job you do. The silence afterward was heavy, but it wasn't hostile. It was the kind of silence that sinks in deep, that makes people turn things over in their minds. Carl stood there, his face flushed, his thermos dangling loosely in his hand. He'd been in this job long enough to know that mistakes happened. Missed stops, wrong turns, mechanical delays. But this mistake was different. It wasn't about the job. It was about judgment. And everyone had just seen it laid bare. The depot seemed quieter now, as though the earlier tension had absorbed some of its usual mechanical noise. Even the rhythmic hum of the idling buses outside felt muted. The small crowd of employees had started to drift back to their work, but many cast a final glance at Harold Bennett before disappearing into the bays or heading for their own vehicles. Carl Weaver stayed where he was, his boots planted on the oil-stained concrete. He watched as Harold adjusted his grip on his cane and took a step toward the exit, the soft tap of wood against the floor marking each movement. Carl cleared his throat. "Mr. Bennett," he began, his voice low, hesitant. Harold stopped and turned, his expression open but unreadable. Carl's eyes flicked down briefly before meeting Harold's gaze again. "I owe you an apology for this morning. I made an assumption I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry. Not because of who you are now that I know your name, but because you deserved better from me as a driver, as a person." For a moment, Harold just looked at him, the silence stretching between them. Then he nodded slowly. "I appreciate that," Harold said, his voice steady, carrying no trace of bitterness. "But remember, respect isn't a gift you give only to those whose names you recognize. It's the foundation of this job, of any service to the public. If you wait to see who someone is before treating them right, you're already too late." Carl swallowed hard and nodded. "I understand." A faint smile touched the corner of Harold's mouth, not unkind but tinged with something heavier. The kind of smile that comes from having given the same advice more times than you can count. The Transit Commission representative stepped forward to escort Harold toward the office for a brief meeting before his tour of the depot. As they walked, Harold's cane clicked softly against the concrete, the sound fading as they reached the corridor. Carl stood there for another moment, staring at the empty space Harold had just occupied. He could still hear his words echoing in his head, blending with the distant hum of the buses. Back in his cab later that day, Carl would drive his route differently. He'd notice faces he might have once overlooked. He'd pull in at every stop where someone waited, no matter how they were dressed or whether they looked like they belonged. Because now, every passenger carried the shadow of that morning and the memory of the man who built the road beneath his wheels.